Galaxy 666 by Pel Toro. Session 45.
Welcome back, brave travelers, to Galaxy 666. As always, your guide Tug here. To begin at an obvious point, Pel seems incapable of mentioning the ground without mentioning all three colors, pink, white, and gray. However, the meat of Chapter 12 comes in two forms, the description of the aliens and the description of the characters. We shall take each in turn, beginning with the aliens. From previous descriptions, we know that the aliens lack a skeleton, have pseudopods and presumed sensory organs in a region loosely identified as their head. To this, Pel adds the idea of the aliens being either spherical, the shape of a haggis, or cylindrical, the shape of a bolster. In other words, blobs. Pel next references a story, one that reportedly comes to the mind of Bronit, as he has a fondness for 19th and 20th century literature. Let us pause here and go a little deeper. The story is, "O whistle, and I'll come to you, my lad," and it was first put down and published in 1904 by Mr. R. M. James in a book, Ghost Stories of Antiquary. In the story, which is a fine traditional ghost story, and I recommend it to you heartily, there is indeed a spirit of sorts that uses bedclothes, sheets and such, to give itself a body. There are two cautions that Pel ignores in the construction of his analysis. The first is this. The creature in Mr. James' story is represented by crumpled sheets. Pel would have been much better off simply saying that the alien resembled crumpled sheets than hearkening back to a short story from 1904. Not only is the story not very well known by people today, though it can be found and is occasionally revamped for television and film, it would have to be one very narrowly focused and well-read specialist to happen to be able to recall it on the fly several thousand years from now. As an example, how many Egyptian or Babylonian short stories would someone know today? Much less from a very esoteric genre, such as ghost stories, and also a not very well-known example from that genre. I can appreciate that Pel wants to recall, or more likely introduce the story to his readers, but it fails as a reference, and the idea that Bronit would happen to know it sounds even more contrived. The second major issue is that haggis, or really even a bolster, looks nothing like a pile of crumpled sheets, animated or otherwise. So the items that Pel gives us provide two contradicting descriptions, like describing a fruit that looks like a bowling ball or a crosscut saw. Before leaving the topic of aliens, the descriptions, they can be called that, which Pel gives of the interior of the alien ship do not leave us with any idea of what the interior looks like. Describe it now to yourself and see how well you do. Color, texture, furnishings, smells, feel, anything. Of course, our team are completely paralyzed and completely devoid of sensation. But Pel contradicts that very premise again and again. Oski notes that the ship seemed to be made of some kind of ceramic material as far as he could see. Inside, Pel tells us, here and there were things they understood. There were also things that were beyond their comprehension. How could they know unless they were able to sense them in some way? And here is the key point that we worked through in previous sessions. The important thing for the writer to do is tell us, the reader, either what we are sensing or what our sympathetic character is sensing. Saying they could tell that the computers were archaic is very different from describing large buttons and lights, switches that harken back to the lab of Dr. Frankenstein, or clean and empty vaults of 6-foot-high humming cabinets with a solitary chair and lonely keyboarded monitor placed before them. This brings us abruptly to our second element of Chapter 12, the descriptions of our main protagonists, and specifically what each of them in turn is thinking. As noted, Pel wants us to understand that they are frozen without any type of sensory input. Let's think about what that would look like. The human has 6 senses, depending on how you count them: touch, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and balance. Balance is one that I break out, though it could be grouped as an extension of touch. Balance comes from the movement of fluid within the semicircular canals of the inner ear and otolithic organs, which sense linear acceleration. With a complete loss of the initial 5 senses, one could still sense changes in acceleration, such as falling. However, our group is absolutely frozen. None of these systems are working. What is an additional question is whether or not this implies the brain is in fact working, or even the autonomic system which powers the heart and controls the breathing is working. The scientific name for having no electrical impulses active in the body is death. It might be that, as this is a science fiction book, our heroes are frozen in time, but as they are still sensing the progression of time, movement to the ship, entry and exit of aliens, we can quickly rule that out. Why the detailed deconstruction on this point? It is necessary to properly examine Ishklaw's pondering of the idea of awareness without a working brain, which is how Pell here defines the concept of a soul. From a story standpoint, we have already deconstructed the description to show clear indications that the brains of our heroes are indeed working, at least working in the most generous definition of that word. From a science fiction standpoint, if Pell desires to show us awareness without our normal senses, then he will need to provide us with understanding without sense-based descriptions, perhaps using solely emotions. Pell can also solve this problem by stepping back into his role as third-person limited narrator. Tell us that the characters are unconscious and then leave them alone, but continue to give us detail and description about what is happening. Finally, Pell can examine the theme of souls, but we will have to leave the body behind and just think in terms of what thoughts one has in their head. Could a soul have memory without a brain, where we know the memories are stored? There are ways to accomplish what Pell is working on, but they require more thought and planning than the Galaxy 666 production timeline allows. Our team of 4, minus Korzak, who is strangely missing from this chapter, provide us random thoughts that do little to help us understand their characters. With Bronit, we continue to gain obscure references of the 19th and 20th century. To this point, Pell has not succeeded in making them sound anything other than a forced excuse to throw in random literary references. But Bronit also asks the bigger questions like, does anything have any meaning anywhere? Apparently there is none in the annals of the 19th and 20th century literature. Ishklaw's the theologian, pondering the soul, good and evil, and the nature of man. Of course it is also Ishklaw who imagines a hell in which to torture the aliens who have, to this point, not really done anything to them. Oski doesn't add much, but he is the subject of the best quip in the chapter. Pell notes that strangeness and fear are not the same thing. This is a good point to clarify for the readers, who might be starting to think they are, and we wouldn't want readers to fall into that trap. Then Pell notes that, in this case, they actually are the same thing. So the readers should jump into that trap because it turns out it isn't a trap at all, but just the way things are. Then, finally, Pell tells us that their being the same thing really only applies to Oski. Will this be Pell's final answer? Or will this be reversed yet again, somewhere further along in
Galaxy 666?
Here ends Session 45.